After a very long summer break, Canadian parliamentarians returned to Parliament Hill this past week to a very changed political landscape. We have a minority government that has been generally propped up by the New Democratic Party. That is, until the leader of that party ripped up the arrangements that had largely given us political stability, and it was expected to last another year. So the fate of this government is much less certain, and the official opposition party has vowed to do everything they can to topple the government and cause an election. If that happens, every pending bill before Parliament gets thrown into the trash, and any new Parliament will have to start from scratch. This new political environment also seems to be subjected to even more procedural wrangling and posturing than before, leaving the fate of pending bills even more precarious. Not only is there a real risk that a vote in the House of Commons could end this government, there's also a real risk that the government will prorogue Parliament, which knocks all parliamentary business off the order paper. Hi, my name is David Fraser. I'm a privacy, internet, and technology lawyer with the Canadian law firm McGuinness Cooper. I also teach internet and media law at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. In this episode, I'm going to look at what digital, tech, and privacy bills are currently pending on the order paper in front of Parliament, and what will be lost if an election is called or if the current government decides to prorogue Parliament. This includes Bill C-26 related to critical infrastructure cyber protection, Bill C-27 related to privacy law reform and artificial intelligence regulation, Bill C-63 related to online harms, and also before the House is Bill S-210 related to restricting access to adult content and age verification systems. The bill that seems to be at greatest risk is Bill C-27, called the Digital Charter Implementation Act 2022, which includes a replacement for our federal privacy law, creates a data protection tribunal, and also includes something called the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. On June 26, 2022, the industry minister François-Philippe Champagne tabled Bill C-27, called the Digital Charter Implementation Act 2022. This was the long-awaited privacy bill designed to replace the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, which has regulated the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information in the course of commercial activity in Canada since 2001. The bill is very similar to Bill C-11, which was tabled in 2020 as the Digital Charter Implementation Act 2020, and which also languished in Parliament until dying when the federal government called the last election. C-27 creates three new laws. The first is the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, or CPPA, which is the main privacy law. The second is the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act, and the third is the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. While I remain a fan of the current privacy law, which has proven to be pretty resilient over the past 20 plus years, the consensus out there is that it is outdated. The most significant difference between PIPEDA and CPPA is what many privacy advocates have been calling for. The Privacy Commissioner will no longer be an ombudsman. The law includes order-making powers and punitive penalties. The bill also creates a new tribunal called the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal, which would replace the current role of the federal court under PIPEDA with greater powers. Other than order-making powers, I don't see much of a difference between what's required under the new CPPA, and what diligent privacy-minded organizations have been doing for years. The privacy portion of this bill has essentially been up for discussion since November 2020, and here we are in September 2024. While it's not perfect, there's a very broad consensus that it should just be passed and we should move on with things. But it has stalled in the committee, and most informed observers think it's not going to be going anywhere. The third part of Bill C-27, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, is a different matter. It's half-baked and leaves far too much to the regulations. I only know one or two people who think that ADA, as it's known, is a defensible bill. It came out of nowhere with virtually no consultation. If ADA hadn't been included in Bill C-27, privacy law reform likely would have breezed through committee in the spring, and we'd be on track to having a new privacy law. But this bill is still in front of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology, where it has been the subject of dozens and dozens and dozens of meetings. They've moved to clause-by-clause consideration, but this has been clogged up with loads of proposed amendments, including those coming directly from the Minister of Industry. But recently, the committee has been sidetracked by a range of motions brought by opposition politicians that seem designed to prevent this bill from leaving committee to head over to the Senate. I'm told that the opposition really wants to deny the governing Liberals any win associated with this bill. So it appears that privacy law reform is not going anywhere federally in Canada. So what else is at risk of dying on the order paper? Bill C-63, also known as the Online Harms Act, is likely not going anywhere before the end of this Parliament. The Online Harms Bill was tabled in February 2024, and it, like Bill C-27, suffers from including more controversial measures with ones that have a generally positive reception. It proposes to create an Online Harms Act that will impose onerous requirements on social media companies. Part 2 of the bill would amend the criminal code to do, among other things, first, create a new hate crime offense if any other crime is motivated by hatred based on enumerated factors. 2, it would create a peace bond related to hate propaganda and hate crime offenses. And 3rd, it would increase the maximum sentences for existing hate propaganda offenses. Part 3 amends the Canada Human Rights Act to provide that it is a discriminatory practice to communicate or cause to be communicated hate speech by means of the internet or other means of telecommunication in a context in which the hate speech is likely to foment detestation or vilification of an individual or group of individuals on the basis of a prohibited ground of discrimination. It then authorizes the Canadian Human Rights Commission to deal with complaints alleging such a discriminatory practice and allows complainants to remain anonymous. Part 4 of C-63 enhances the existing laws related to the mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse materials. Now, Parts 2 and 3 have been highly controversial. I personally have some concerns with Part 1, including overly broad definitions of harmful content, particularly regarding, quote, intimate content communicated without consent, unquote, and the excessive powers granted to this new Digital Safety Commission, such as warrantless inspections and the ability to issue takedown orders with minimal, virtually no due process. While the bill aims to address child sexual abuse materials and non-consensual distribution of intimate images, its flaws raise significant concerns about potential charter violations and the risk of unintended consequences such as suppression of legitimate expression and the disincentivization of online service providers to operate in Canada. C-63 is at first reading, so has not yet been referred to a committee. I don't see it going anywhere before this parliamentary session ends either. The next bill that I've spoken about before is Bill S-210, Protecting Young Persons from Exposure to Pornography Act. This is a private member's bill that started in the Senate, made it through to the House, and is actually ready to be voted on a final time. I'll refer you to my previous discussion of the bill, but in a nutshell, it is deeply problematic. At its core, it requires age verification for any platforms that may expose a young person to sexually explicit content. Its stated intent is to prevent young people from accessing sexually explicit material online. The bill requires age verification for any website containing such material, but its broad definition of, quote, sexually explicit, unquote, and the lack of effective age verification methods raises concerns about privacy, freedom of expression, and access to information. Also, the bill's definition of sexually explicit material is overly broad, encompassing educational resources and a wide range of online content. Now, we know that current age verification methods are flawed, often requiring personal information to be collected that then could be misused. The bill's enforcement mechanisms grant excessive power to the CRTC, allowing them to block websites without sufficient evidence of wrongdoing. At its end, Bill S-210 is a poorly drafted, heavy-handed approach that infringes on Canadians' rights and freedoms. If there's a bill before Parliament that really should die, this is it. But it could be put to a vote at any time, and up until this stage, it has had the support of all the opposition parties, so conceivably could pass in a minority parliament. The last bill that I'm going to discuss is Bill C-26, the Critical Cyber Systems Protection Act. This is a bill that hasn't gotten much attention, and I regret I haven't done an overview of it for this channel. Essentially, it will regulate telecommunications service providers, interprovincial or international pipeline and power line systems, nuclear energy systems, transportation systems, that are within the legislative authority of Parliament, banking systems, and clearing and settlement systems. And the regulation will likely extend deep into the supply chains of each of those industries. Essentially, the government, largely through existing regulators, will be able to dictate to companies the steps they have to take or cannot take in order to ostensibly strengthen the cybersecurity of these organizations and to prevent risks of interference, manipulation, disruption, or degradation. These orders can be secret orders, and there are credible critics who say these could be used to undermine encryption and other measures that companies are taking to keep their customers and their users secure. The best example of what sort of thing this bill could be used for would be, for an example, an order that all Canadian telecommunications service providers to remove all equipment provided by Chinese companies. Like other government bills affecting the digital space, the regulators have enormous power to compel the production of records, and there are massive penalties for non-compliance. In short, Bill C-26 is overreaching and secretive. It could be much improved, but it's made it through the House of Commons and is now in the Senate awaiting consideration by committee. We could see this pass, and we could see this become law this session. In general, I've been very critical of many of the digital bills pushed by this government, from the Online Streaming Act and the Online News Act, both of which have already passed, and the ones that I've referred to in this discussion. But as we head into the fall with a changed parliament, I thought those with an interest in this sort of stuff should know what's on the line if the opposition forces an election or if the government prorogues parliament. I hope this has been interesting and useful. I try to put out a new video every few weeks, so if you're interested in this sort of content and you've stuck around to the end, you probably are. So please click the like and subscribe buttons. Also leave a comment if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for other topics to cover. And of course, feel free to share this with anyone who you think may be interested in hearing about Canadian tech and privacy law. Thanks for tuning in.